Howdy hackers, and welcome to another episode of FairLight TV. Today the topic is around one of the peripherals that was a very cool thing back in the days, but it's now really obsoleted, and we're getting back to why that is. We are going to talk about modems, why they became fashionable and why they don't really work today, at least not the traditional modems that were sold back in the day. So over to serial modems. So during the very first years of C64, we traded everything over post or manual swapping over schoolyard swapping, where you actually kind of handed over data over a physical medium to somebody. And only after a few years did we have modems where we could use telephone lines to convey content that we had on one computer and send it to another computer. And since my long history is actually in telecom, I feel I'm rather equipped to handle the topic here. So let's go into how modems work and why they don't work anymore. Yes, like so. So there are, first of all, two kind of signals. You have the analog signal and you have the digital signal. A digital signal is ones and zeros, and an analog signal is like a variable wave where it could hold any sort of value. The benefit of a digital signal is that it's absolutely 100% perfect when you send it and receive it, and you can duplicate it and you can resend it, and you would have a signal that is exactly the same regardless of how long you transmit it. Whereas an analog signal is going to decay over time. So think of it like copying. If you print a digital document, it becomes very much the same or 100% same every time. Whereas an analog signal is more like copying an A4 paper, which is sort of decaying for every copy. So it decays over time. So analog is sort of the old thing and digital is sort of the new thing here. And telephony in general is conveying voice messages between two destinations. You are connecting two destinations and they can communicate. And the original concept was basically a copper line that was stretching between 2 points, and you can only communicate between those 2 points. It's not very convenient, but I mean, it's a lot better than not being able to communicate at all. But if you wanted to communicate one to many, so on a per call basis, you would like to select the destination. Today, I have a copper line drawn to this destination, but I don't want to talk to them. I want to speak to somebody else. Then you would need multiple copper lines, or you would need some sort of solution like a web or a matrix where you can send your call in and then that call would be routed to the destination. Something like this. So you send your call into some sort of system, and then the system would have mechanism to detect which destination you are bound for. The very, very early telephone systems had this kind of switch. Let's call it a flash switch or something else. So predominantly female representation here that took calls, and using manual like matrices, they could connect calls. The incoming calls could be connected to an outgoing line. So it's all very physical. It's very connecting a metal connection still between the sender and the destination, but using switch technicians here or switch personnel as the vehicle for connecting the sender and the receiver here. The next generation here was, of course, to automate that, because it's not really convenient to talk to a person, because you would need to employ thousands and thousands, well, per country or per million subscribers, and doesn't really scale. So eventually there was an automated way to make that connection. It's still sort of physical metal connecting from the sender to the destination using this. So you had like a matrix here where you could connect the sender and the receiver here. And if you run a modem here, a modem is a modulator demodulator. So it takes a digital signal that comes from the computer, modulate it so it can run on the copper line, and then the receiving modem is demodulating that signal into the same digital signal that originally came from the sending computer here. Something along the line of what you see here. One of the things that was possible if you had that kind of a setup was blue boxing. So in order for the system to connect the call, disconnect the call, and place the call, there needs to be some sort of control mechanism. We call that signaling. And given that you only basically had the copper line, all the signaling took place inside the same copper line, the same like voice channel that you as the sender and receiver were using. That was also used by the telephony system here. And it was then possible to mimic that signaling using equipments. And Blue Box was sort of the first one. This is a picture of it said in the Wikipedia article that it was sold by Steve Wozniak to Steve Jobs. I have no idea, but yeah. So this is one of the blue box, actually blue boxes. Then with this one, you could communicate to the switches so they would connect your call, and your local connection wasn't aware that you were making that call because you are not placing the call via that mechanism. So it wasn't charging you anything, but because it wasn't aware that you actually made the call. Very inconvenient if you're a telephony company to have in-band signaling exposing the control mechanism to the user interface. So the third generation here, and these are like my generation definitions. These are not like official ones, but I guess if you ask anybody who's been in the industry for quite some time, they will probably describe it very similarly. And I'm sure there are like sub-generations, but let's not dig into too much of details. This is still sort of a rather shallow run through of this. This is an Ericsson AXE, so it's a digital switch. And then it works rather differently. So you still have the copper going to the end customer, but at the interface between the telephone network and sort of the customer connection, you are sampling the voice call 8 bytes at 8 kilohertz. And that means that you get a data flow of 64 kilobits per second. So the entire digital telephony system back in the days was built on 64 kilobits per second lines. It's circuit switched, which means that there is a line, still think of it like a copper line, only like a digital copper line inside the system. And that's digital or virtual copper line is still 64 kilobits per second, fixed. So if you had a call, nobody was saying anything, it was still consuming 64 kilobits per second. And it was there for you. And if you had that call, the network was allocating that for you throughout the entire call. Then you could have the issue that there weren't enough slots available. So if you called somebody and there wasn't a slot available from the source to the destination, you could experience blocking. That's sort of not a thing anymore, but then you could have blocking because it's actually like a very fixed number of potential calls that the system can handle, and there are always like bottlenecks. So the digital connection was 64 kilobits per second, and originally you would have 2.4 or even 300 boards, and then you would have 75 1200, the split speed modems, and then you would have 1200s, 2400, 9600s, and then US Robotics came with their HST, which I think was 14.4, and then you had like standard defined 14.4 to 28.8, and then I think we came to 56. So 56 is absolutely amazing. Think of it like having 64 kilobits, and they managed to squeeze through 56 kilobits per second, even if they're sort of modulating the signal into that digital signal. So it's absolutely amazing that that was technically possible. But that is sort of a theoretical maximum from a 64 kilobits per second if you are sending an analog signal into a digital system. If you go all digital, of course, the sky is the limit here. But again, if the receiving part is sampling at 64 kilobits per second, getting 56 is great. Okay, so what this looked like was you would still have the computer that talk using the serial connection, serial digital connection to the modem. The modem talks to the phone network, and the phone network then in the edges sample to digital 64 kilobits per second lines, and then they convey it over an SDH network, or it was, that's one of the sort of core technologies for handling 64 kilobits per second lines. Possibly you would heard stuff like VC12, which is a 2 megabit line, and that a 2 megabit line can handle 30 concurrent calls, and then the last 2 slots were used for signaling. So in digital system, blue boxing and stuff like that isn't possible because signaling is outside. It's not inbound, it's out of band signaling in all the digital systems here. But what you see here is that the modem feeds in an analog signal, and out of the SDH network on the other side should be basically an identical serial wave from what you send in. It's just that it has been conveyed over the longer distance here, over the SDH network, in the form of a 64 kilobit per second trunk. When we go into the IP world, now most of the networks are fully IP, and you are running everything on top of IT. And the signals are no longer sampled into 64 kilobits per second trunks. They are sampled, and then they are run through a codec, and a codec here is a coder and decoder, pretty much like modem, like a modulator and demodulator. So it's taking the analog voice, which it presumed it is, and then code it in a way which is going to be as small as possible, still maintaining all the characteristics of the voice. And then that is sent over the IP network and then decoded in the other end. One of the more predominant systems for this is SIP RTP, where SIP is the control signaling and RTP is real-time protocol. So SIP controls it, and the RTP stream is the payload, the actual voice. And there are multiple codecs here. A number are very, very standard. And if you look at telephony networks today, they use only like a few standards. But you don't need to have the ones that used in telephony system. You would have stuff like Opus, which is Google's, which is used in Google Meet, because all the over-the-top communication over internet also use the same sort of structure now that the telephone company is using, or I should possibly say it the other way around. Telephony networks now use the same standards that have been prevalent in the internet domain over a number of years. And here the concept of trunk, like fixed allocated static allocation of traffic and bandwidth between two destinations, is no longer valid, because this is a packet network. It's no longer circuit switch. You take the codecs take the continuous stream and put it in packets and send the packets away, and then the real-time stream is rebuilt on the decodec side. So again, there is no call blockage typically, but of course, if too many people are using the same resources, everybody would have problems. But up until the time when everybody's having problems, nobody's having any problem. Okay, so if you look at the schematics, it would be something like this, where you would have the computer sent to the modem, and the modem sends to a codec, and the codec is taking that serial voice, analog voice stream, and then doing its compression, assuming its voice, sending it over the IP network, and in the receiving end, trying to reconstruct the analog. But the analog that comes in and the analog that comes out, they are vastly different, because you have been using a lossy compression, which means that they are trying to make something that sounds voice-like, but anything like any part of the voice spectrum that is outside of normal voice, that is not really covered, because they have been using, again, lossy compression. So the receiving modem will be all confused, because the analog signal doesn't contain what it's expecting to see in the analog signal it received. So this no longer works, right? If you have one of those 56 kilobits per second modem, US Robotics 56K modem, I'm sorry, it will not work if you have any sort of IP connectivity where SIP RTP is part of that. The transition between the modem and the phone system using the analog line, it does only work for voice at the moment. Or if you try to fax using this, it would be the same thing. It does not work. Just a few examples of the codecs here, and just to see that some of them are optimized for higher bandwidths, and some of them are optimized for lower bandwidth. Some of them are adding, or all of them are adding, a bit of a buffer, so there will be delays. But if you are very keen to have a very, very small delay, then a few of the codecs are preferable over the others. And then the source data volume you're sending in versus the destination that is actually consumed by the transport network is also different between them. And some of them are open source, and some of them are, if you pay a royalty fee, and some are license only. One of the very convenient one would be Opus, because it's open source, and it handles basically the entire spectrum from very narrow band to very wide band. So just like a recap of the history here. The first generation of data was data that run on top of a voice connection. In mobile, you had GSM. You would run a modem on top of the voice in the mobile networks. So that was 2G. 2.5G was the introduction of GPRS. And then suddenly the mobile network had voice and data in parallel. The data was a separate service. It was not run as a modulation on top of the voice. It was run as a digital service in parallel to the voice. In 3G was the same, so two parallel services. Only, of course, the data was a lot faster, but still a separate service, voice there, data here. In 4G and onwards, there is no such thing as voice as a bearer service. You only have the IP connectivity, and then you run voice on top of data. So you see here, data ran on top of voice, then parallel, and now the roles are switched. The main service now is data, and voice is just a little application that sits on top of the data bearer. In fixed networks, you had like the traditional modems that we discussed so far. What happens then was that you had basically at the same time ISDN and ADSL. So ISDN was digitizing the connection. You would run a digital service where you would have two lines that could be used for either voice or data. So you could have two parallel voice calls. You could have two data calls. So you would have 64 plus 64 kilobits per second. So 128 kilobits per second at the time when ISDN was introduced was great. It was great. ADSL was a totally different modulation of the connection over the copper. The part of the spectrum that was used by voice was retained, and then data was used for the rest. So it was basically two parallel service, a bit like GPRS, so two parallel service that wouldn't interfere between one and another. But of course, the potential data rates were reduced by the fact that it needed to not mess with the part used for voice. And then you had VDSL, which took over the entire copper line, and there was no potential voice going there as well. So you just had VSL, and that was it. And if you wanted to have voice, you would have voice over data, pretty much like in 4G, where you have voice over data. And of course, fiber is all data, and you would also have voice as an application over data. So just a brief thing on modems today. When you connect a computer to a modem today, they are not like modems anymore. There is no analog modulation. They are basically taking the digital serial communication and put them into IP. Let's see if we have it here. So this is a C64 modem. They're still called modems, even if it's absolutely not a modem. It's basically a serial to IP device. So the C64 still sees this as a unit which it can communicate via a serial interface. You can still use the HAYES command, the AT commands, but the logic inside this device makes it connect over IP. And then a similar device in the other end would convert that IP connectivity back to the serial communication, back to the computer in the other end. So the computers couldn't see a difference if this was run over this device, a traditional modem over something which is then sampled into 64 kilobits per second, or if it ran via a normal or totally obsoleted copper line. From the computer perspective, it would look 100% the same. The interface for the computer is the same digital serial interface. It's just that the devices that handle network infrastructure in between are now or have changed dramatically over the years. So, these are two examples of terminal interfaces, and this is applicable for C64 Amiga and also PCs. If you are communicating using the serial interface, you can still use a terminal program if it's CCGMS on the 64, or this is A-term or whatever it was called on the Amiga. So they are both working the same way, regardless of what kind of device you feed it with, but because they are still communicating via like a serial interface. The change from this is when you start adding network interfaces, which would need like native IP drivers in the computer, because then it's no longer using a serial interface. Then it becomes something totally different. But serial interfaces are the same from the 80s up until today. So if you have computers from the 80s, the really early 80s that used modems, they still can use the same program, because from the computer perspective, this is still the same, even if the world outside changed. But you cannot use a traditional modem over something which is a telephony network that runs SIP RTP. That would absolutely not work. And this is why modems are totally out of fashion. The old modems. Feel free to buy as many as you want, but don't pay much for them, because the supply and demand says that supply, great, demand, minuscule. So if you are one of those who really would like to have modems, do not pay a lot for them, because the supply is massive and you are the very, very little slim demand there is on the market. I hope you learned something new about telephony systems and modems. That was everything for today. I hope you have learned a lot about modems and telephony system. You didn't expect a crash course in telephony system, did you? But on FairLight TV, you get that as well. Enjoy and have a nice time until we meet again. Bye bye.